It all started with small, unnoticeable changes. Ethan began to feel strange, like something was off with his body, though he couldn't quite place it. At first, it was just mild discomfort in his legs and hands, a dull ache that came and went as if his muscles were sore, but not in any way he could explain. Then came the headaches, sharp, intense, throbbing in his temples. But these could easily be attributed to stress, long hours at work, or his lack of sleep. Nothing seemed particularly alarming. That is, until the night it all began to change. Ethan woke up one morning with an intense, unbearable itch on his chest. Rubbing his hand over it, he felt a patch of thick fur growing just beneath the skin. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled back the covers, staring down at his body in disbelief. He ran his fingers over the fur again, heart racing. This wasn't a rash or some allergic reaction. It was real. His first instinct was to panic, but he steadied himself. He couldn't afford to lose his composure. He rushed to the bathroom, barely making it past the living room before stopping dead in his tracks. The reflection staring back at him from the mirror was not his own. His eyes, normally a dull brown, were now a deep, almost golden amber. His pupils were sharp and elongated, like the eyes of a predator. "Ethan, calm down," he whispered, his voice sounding strange even to himself, as though it wasn't his own. His heart pounded and his mind screamed for him to figure out what was happening, but all he could do was stare at his reflection in horror. The changes were slow, relentless. It wasn't just his eyes anymore. His teeth had elongated into sharp fangs, and his hands, they were no longer hands. His fingers had begun to fuse together, thickening into something more canine. The sharp tips of his nails turned into claws, and his feet soon followed the same grotesque transformation. Ethan felt like he was losing control of his own body, slipping away into something primal. Days passed, but the transformations didn't stop. Every morning, Ethan would wake up to find his body slowly becoming more and more like a dog's, until one day, the inevitable happened. He had been walking to the kitchen when the change accelerated. His body contorted painfully, as if something deep inside of him was fighting to emerge, to take control. He fell to his hands and knees, struggling to maintain some semblance of his human self. But it was too late. His spine twisted, his body shifted, and in a horrifying instant, he was no longer standing on 2 feet. He was on all fours. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, but it was no use. He was no longer the person he once was. He was now something else, something less. Frantic, Ethan crawled across the floor in a panic. He tried to speak, to scream, to call out, but all that came from his throat were strangled growls and whimpers. His voice was lost, replaced by the raw sounds of an animal. He tried to think, to reason, but the more his body changed, the less human he felt. His mind was clouded, foggy, drowning in instinct. The thoughts that had once been clear and logical were now nothing more than fleeting images, fragmented like broken glass. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized with chilling clarity that he had lost control. The transformation was complete. Ethan was now a dog, an animal, unable to communicate, unable to live the life he once had. He could still understand his surroundings, still retain flashes of his former life, but it was like trying to see through a fog, everything distant and obscured. The worst part was the curse he could feel settling deep inside him. This wasn't a simple disease. It wasn't a physical condition. It was something darker, something supernatural. He didn't know how or why this was happening to him, but deep down he knew it was no accident. Ethan had heard stories, heard whispers from his grandmother about ancient curses, about people who had brought misfortune upon themselves by meddling with forces they didn't understand. His grandmother had always been the superstitious one, warning him to never play with things that belonged to the past. She'd told him tales of forgotten rites and rituals, of people who had done things in their youth that they later regretted, things they could never undo. Had he done something too? Something foolish, something that had summoned this fate upon him? He thought back to his childhood, to the odd symbols he had found etched into the ground one summer night near the forest, a place that had always felt strange to him. He had ignored it at the time, chalking it up to some old family myth. But now, as he crouched on the floor, his body no longer his own, the answer seemed all too clear. This was a curse, one he had brought upon himself, one that had been placed upon him by forces far older than anything he could comprehend. Days turned into weeks. Every moment felt like an eternity.